So, to get back to our discussion board, before we do that, let's see. Somebody asked about sewing. Yes, Marissa asked about the sewing quilt, quilted or knotted. What's that all about? Good question. Well, the sewing is where the evidence is. The erratic sewing that Mrs. Hale undoes, again, evidence of Mrs. Wright being a little out of her mind. And also, how does she kill him? With a knot. And there are two different stitches to do when sewing. There's quilting and then there's knotting, and I don't really know the difference. Now, so at the end when that question comes up, the women say, knot it, because that's exactly what she did to her husband. So the sewing is important, it's evidence. She had the skill to make a knot to kill him with in his sleep. So good question, Marissa, good detail, good detail. So a sort of concluding remark on that section from Haley. I believe that they hid the bird because they knew it was incriminating evidence in the minds of the men to Mrs. Wright's guilt. They pity Mrs. Wright, knowing that she was lonely and suspecting her home life wasn't great, so they want to protect her from being convicted and living an even worse life as a criminal. They do this because of their loyalty to their own sex, because they have a desire to protect the other woman. And just one more item on the historical nature of a woman's life then, because some of you might think, well, why didn't she just leave him? Well, that wasn't a possibility. A woman, early 1900s, Midwest country, walks out on her husband. What are her choices? Go to the city, work in a factory at best, become a prostitute at worst. She didn't have a lot of options. Domestic violence shelters did not exist. Opportunity for her to go to the local community college, get a degree and a job, that's not happening. Basically, the best role that she could hope for in life was to be a housewife. It's not going well for her, but she didn't have any other options. So always important to put these in their historical context. Okay, so some concluding remarks here that I have circled somewhere. No, Shay, Mrs. Peters is not hiding anything, except the evidence. She did not participate in the murder at all, but I like the way you think. Okay, so where are we to wrap this up? First off, very good job on the discussion boards. You guys had great questions, great answers. I like that some of you got a little off the wall, which is always very appreciated. Don't be afraid to do that. And just keep up the good work, and I think we're going to be fine. Hopefully I'll get better at doing these videos. This is my first one. Maybe we'll go outside, do something a little more fun than this, but I think we're getting the job done. So to conclude up our time with Trifles, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are much more in tune with Mrs. Wright because they are all women. The men are completely out of tune, out of touch with it. The men would never understand why Mrs. Wright would justifiably kill her husband. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. She shouldn't kill her husband. People shouldn't kill other people. Maybe if the same events in the story happened in 2020, maybe it would be a little different, maybe. But she was boxed in. She was like the caged bird. And the cage is all bent as well, so we know there's some violence. He has certainly had a violent streak. But she really is like a caged bird with this life in 1916. And if she had left him, it would not have gone well. If she had been wound up on trial, that would not have gone well because she would not have had a jury of her peers. So Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, Mrs. Hale has the idea first and actually starts to destroy evidence when she rips the seam. and then they both hide the bird. They do that because they identify with her. Mrs. Hale feels guilty for not visiting. She knows what a nasty guy Mr. Wright was. Mrs. Peters identifies with her in the loneliness of the Midwestern housewife from this time period. She had a pet killed, and of course the men do nothing to endear themselves to the women. Now there is the key moment in the play when we know, because there's the suspense here is Mrs. Peters going to go along with hiding the evidence? So the key moment comes when they ask what happened. The men ask what happened to the bird, and Mrs. Peters, who has already stated that Mrs. Wright does not like cats, her cat got into Mrs. Wright's jail cell. And the men ask, well, that's interesting, I'm sure. Has the bird flown? Mrs. Hale: we think the cat got it. County Attorney: is there a cat? Mrs. Hale glances in a quick, covert way at Mrs. Peters. And this is it. What's she going to do? They leave, Mrs. Peters said. Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave. I like the way she says that. She doesn't quite say yes or no, but she certainly doesn't say, oh no, there was no cat. So that's the moment when we know that she is complicit in the covering up of evidence. Again, as we've said all semester, whether you think it was the right thing for them to do or not says more about you than it does about the play. And it is an interesting question. But I think it's safe to say our author, Susan Glaspell, would say they certainly were justified, and they saved an abused woman from going to jail at the hands of men who killed her husband because he was a bad husband, more than bad, abusive. So thanks a lot for tuning in. Try to spiff things up in future videos. Let me know how this went. Drop me an email. I would love to hear from all of you. Let's stay connected. And thanks a lot. Thanks for coming over. Bye.